I begin by congratulating you and the others responsible for their uncanny foresight in selecting as early as the 31st of March 1975 this motion for debate in the Oxford Union. I don't know whether you had a hotline to number 10 or whether you simply inferred or your instinct led you to conclude that at that time there would in fact be a referendum, and the decision of such great importance as it is being taken by the whole country only 2 days after this debate was staged. But anyway, it is a singular triumph for you, sir, and I think we're all aware of this here tonight, that we are engaging in not just a debate in which the members of the Oxford Union are engaged, but we are conducting a debate which the whole country, or a very large part of it, is deeply concerned in, and which very many are watching, I believe, tonight. And may I also congratulate the speakers who have just put their case, not the case that I would myself accept, but nevertheless they put their case with obvious sincerity, although I think with a very significantly different emphases, as some have looked to the future in Europe from the point of view of perhaps some kind of union, of a federal union nature, for reasons which are obvious. Others, the original mover of the motion, was obviously deeply concerned that there should develop in Western Europe some new great center of power in the world, which carries with it implications, of course, for the security of the West and indeed the security of the whole world, and further implications about the integration of peoples, of governments, of the development of common institutions and the like. And I also congratulate very warmly indeed my own opposer, who has put the case already so very well. Now, sir, I'd like also to make my last bit of congratulation, which is to welcome the fact that the motion here puts without ambiguity the central question that the country will decide in 2 days' time. The central question is, of course, the question of whether we are going to say yes to entry to the common market. Well, whether we are saying yes, if Mr. Heath will only contain himself for one moment, is our... He knows very well, and he wishes more ardently than anyone in Britain, that the gift of choice, which is now with the British people, was not theirs. Because his, of course, his... Well, I don't mind people saying shame, but you know, simply on the record, the one thing that the country did not have when faced with the great decision, whether rightly or wrongly, the decision itself of joining the common market 3 years ago, the one thing that it was denied was the right of the British people to have their say as to whether or not, whether by general election or by referendum or by any other means, the British people were left out entirely of the whole consideration. And it has taken us, after a great fight and with much help from thousands and hundreds of thousands of people throughout the country, to bring us at least to the point where the British people have the right to say that this is right for them or not. So do not despise the fact that your own fellow citizens have at last been given the right which Mr. Heath denied them. Now, I want to say this. One thing which is wrong, of course, with this motion is that it says Europe. And what we are talking about is not some generalized consent to Europe. What we are asked to do is to say yes to a particular group of European nations and enter into, with them, a particular form of relationship, a particular contract, a particular treaty. And it is time that in considering this whole matter, we should put to ourselves the facts that the 8 countries of Western Europe, important as they are not even half of Western Europe itself, let alone the whole of the continent of Europe. Nor, for that matter, should we ignore the fact that there exists outside the continent of Europe altogether more European people or people of European origin in the great continents of North America, Latin America, and Australasia than there exists in the whole common market put together. And beyond that, we should recall the fact that our horizon and the concerns that we have in the world as a country and as a people are not limited to 8 nations and 200 million people in Western Europe, but to the 3,000 million people and the 140 nations that exist in the 6 continents of the world. And the policies that we pursue as a government, the causes that we follow as a people, the concerns that we have are not confined to and limited to this narrow area across the Channel. For that to happen to Britain will be a contraction and a reduction of all the things with which we have been concerned. It is the world that we belong to, and it is mankind of which we are part. So let us hear. Let us hear no more. Let us hear no more. Let us hear no more of the overwhelming importance in the world perspective of these 8 countries that exist on the other side of the Channel. Now, sir, of course, I think what we have to also remember is this. We have to remember what is involved in this particular treaty that Mr. Heath signed, not on my behalf, which he signed without the authority of the British people. What was taken on? Well, yes. Every convention, every precedent that we've had as a country, every time that anyone in the history of Britain has proposed to change what are basically the rules of the political operation of our country, whether it was to reduce the powers of the House of Lords, whether it was to extend the electorate from what it was in the past, a very restricted one, to a much broader one, whenever that's happened, whenever a major change has taken place in the way in which our democracy operates, in the rights of our people, in how the Constitution itself of our country operates, whenever that's happened, and whenever there has been a major disagreement between the government of the day and Her Majesty's opposition, whenever that's happened, every government in British history, except for Mr. Heath, has felt the duty, the obligation to go to the people to get their consent for that change. He didn't do it. He didn't do it. And what is involved in the Common Market Treaty, in the Rome Treaty, is something which at last the country has understood goes far beyond any matter of economics, however important they may be, and I'll have something to say about that in a moment. But what it goes beyond is a simple but basic, of course, change in that Britain now has, for the first time, yes, a written constitution. A written constitution which no one in Britain has had any hand in shaping. And you know what that constitution is. The superior constitution which now guides and binds British governments is the Treaty of Rome. There exists a law, a power to make laws, a power to levy taxes, a power to develop policies, which is superior to those powers of taxation and of lawmaking in the British Parliament itself. That's the change. Don't tell me that that isn't something that doesn't matter to you. Well, if it doesn't matter to you, then something terrible has happened to the British people, because it is the power, precisely those powers of deciding your own laws, which is the very heart of your own democracy. And if you don't think that doesn't matter, then by God, you are indeed a strange generation that has come to Oxford. now I turn from the gravity, I would say the enormity, of what was involved in that transfer, as he would have it, irrevocable transfer of democratic power to others outside this country. I turn from that to the actual nature, the actual consequences, as it were, of the treaty itself. I said it was not just a treaty about trade. If it was, and it was about cooperation, it was about many forms of cooperation. You wouldn't just have me opposing as I have opposed. Of course not. I believe in extending the area of trade and cooperation with Western Europe. Believe in it as strongly as anyone else. But there are within this treaty enormous provisions which have consequences for Britain, which are of the most serious kind. You'd be very foolish indeed if you sought to ignore them. Because what the Treaty of Rome, of course, insists is not just that we trade freely with each other, but that first we have no frontier as far as the movement of money is concerned. And every British government since 1939 has felt it necessary to control the movement of money out of Britain, and for very obvious reasons. Not only is money free to move, but firms are free to move. That is part of the rights of the Treaty of Rome that it gives to business firms. And therefore, if governments in Britain are seeking, for reasons which you surely would understand, that is to say, to protect the employment and the livelihood of our own people, and if therefore they wish to exercise those controls to prevent money and firms moving out of Britain, the rights of the British Parliament will be overridden by the actual rules, regulations, and superior law of the treaty itself. Does it matter? Yes, I think it does. And on top of that, of course, you have got an agricultural food policy system. I do not believe that it is right for any elected government to hand to others such serious matters that affect the welfare of our whole nation. But it has, you may say, who indeed is responsible for Britain's food and agriculture today? And how much longer will it even be worth calling on the Ministry of Agriculture? You may say, oh well, what a splendid fellow Monsieur Lardinois is. What a splendid fellow. No doubt, but I tell you this, he's not elected and he's not responsible to anyone in this land. He is the man who is deciding more than any other person the policies that affect the food and the agriculture of the whole of Western Europe. I do not think that that's a very happy arrangement. And of course, the policy that he's carrying out is the policy that is written into the treaty itself. That is to say, a policy which seeks to protect the entirely different structure of farming that has developed in Germany and France and elsewhere. Entirely different. And you know how different it is. If you've got 15% of your population working on small farms, as they have in France, or you have 8 or 9% in Germany, or 20% in Italy, compared with 3% in Britain, what kind of cost structure and food price structure do you expect to get? Well, of course, a protected agriculture on the continent of Europe is an entirely different thing from the kind of open policies that we've pursued ever since we made the great national decision to repeal our own corn laws, to get rid of taxes on imported food, and to develop, in partnership with our own people who went out to New Zealand and Australia and Canada and elsewhere, an ongoing and continuing relationship in the supply of food. Well, those who seek to frighten us now by saying, on the basis of the one special crisis year of 73-4, that somehow the world food situation has been totally transformed, and what was previously always recognized as one of the great handicaps and drawbacks of the common market, the agricultural policy and food prices, suddenly become an asset. They're talking through their hats. And indeed, even now, there is only one commodity, one foodstuff that we buy from Western Europe, which is actually cheaper in the common market than it is in the world outside. And that won't last very long either. I'm referring to sugar. Wheat, maize, beef, butter, lamb, all the rest of it are today taxed and heavily taxed at the frontiers of the common market. And if the common market countries believe what so many gullible people in this country have been asked to believe in this last few weeks, that is to say, that there was no more food in the rest of the world and the prices were permanently higher outside than in. But it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, that the common market is clutching to its protective devices and won't even discuss them in the multilateral trade negotiations which are now taking place. So anxious to preserve the levies on imported food, the export subsidies to help get rid of their surpluses, the system of intervention that leads to the mountains of this and that, so anxious that they're not even prepared to discuss with the other countries of the world in what ways, in the general context of international trade, these things might be changed. Well, so there's that. And of course, the treaty went further. What was also involved in the signing of the Rome Treaty was the acceptance of arrangements for financing the whole common market affair. I won't go into details with that. It would take too long. But there is no one who knows and has studied these things who does not agree that the contribution that Britain is going to have to make, and I'm not thinking just of our gross contribution, but our net contribution, is wholly disproportionate to our actual, as it were, income within that of the total community, and is wholly damaging to this country. Indeed, our own estimates are that by the end of the 5-year transition period, that is to say 78, 980, something of the order of £300 to £400 million a year will flow net out of Britain for that reason alone. That is to say, our net contribution to the community's budget. I do not think that's in the interest of Britain. Nor do I think the interest of Britain, the money and firms should be free to move there either. And if anyone doubts the gravity of that, I'll give them one illustration. In the 3-year period, 71, 2 and 3, Mr. Barber, you may remember him, allowed relatively free movement of money out of Britain to Europe. £1,000 million of British capital went into direct investment in plants, machinery, jobs on the European continent. And there came back £170 million at the same time. And when you think that in terms of numbers and prosperity there are 55 million of us and 200 million of them, is it not an extraordinary disproportion that that should be so? And can you not see the danger, the gravity of what that means for the future prosperity of this country, this generation, and those to come? And I say to you, this is not a treaty which in any way is a fair and equal treaty. It's not negotiated, it was accepted. Not one word, not a comma, let alone a clause, let alone a paragraph of the Rome Treaty. Not one comma has been altered in order to meet the perfectly legitimate and serious differences that exist between Britain and the common market. And now the experience itself, 3.5 years ago, when they were urging us to go in, oh, what a campaign it was. You've got to get in to get on, was the slogan of that day. £5 or £6 a week better off for Britain if we can only get into the common market. All the goodies were spread out, and Donald Stokes of Leyland buying one-page advertisements saying, all we need is a great domestic market of 250 million, and we will sweep Europe. And you know what has happened, and this is the one significance of the trade figure. I'm not arguing who cares about the actual details of the size. That doesn't matter, it's the trend. The trend. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we were almost in balance with the common market countries. What's happened since? 500 million down in 72, 1,000 million in 73, 2,000 million in 74, running now at the rate of 2,400 million this year. Don't you see what that's going to do to the prosperity of this country? You can't go on borrowing that. And then you add to that the burdens I mentioned a moment ago, and we are under great threat. We're in peril at the present time, and the country must know it. And therefore now what do they say? What is the message that comes now? No longer to tell the British people about the goodies that lie there. No longer that. That won't wash, will it? Because the evidence will no longer support it. And so the message that comes out is fair, fair, Fear. Fear because you won't have any food. Fear of unemployment. Fear that we've somehow been so reduced as a country that we can no longer, as it were, totter about in the world, independent as a nation. And a constant attrition of our morale, a constant attempt to tell us that what we have, and what we have is not only our own achievement, but what generations of Englishmen have helped us to achieve, is not worth a damn. The kind of laughter that greeted the early references that I made, that what was involved was the transfer of the whole of our democratic system to others. Not a damn. Well, I tell you, what we now have to face in Britain, what the whole argument is about, now that the fraud and the promise has been exposed, what it's about is basically the morale and the self-confidence of our people. We can shape our future. We are 55 million people. If you look around the world today, I listen to Gough Whitlam and his 14 million Australians, and he trades heavily with Japan. I'm very fond of the Australians. But do you think he's going to enter into a relationship with Japan, which gives Japan the right to make the laws in Australia? Do you think Canada, 22 million of them, and to the south, a great and friendly nation? Yes, they are. But do you think Canada is going to allow its laws to be written by the 200 million people in some union in America? No, of course not. The whole thing is an absurdity, and therefore I urge you to reject it. I urge you to say no to this motion, and I urge the whole British country to say no on Thursday in the referendum.